Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. I'm Lisa Reyes Mason from the University of Denver. I use she and her pronouns, and I am so very pleased to welcome you who are here in the room with us and those folks who are joining the live stream to this critical conversation for environmental justice. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Mary Collins for inviting us to convene this symposium. And I'd especially like to thank my co-organizer, Dr. Felicia Mitchell, who's here in the front row, for so thoughtfully planning this event with me today. So if you were at yesterday's opening blessing and ceremony, then you know that we were called upon to remember. And it was a coincidence, but maybe it was meant to be that we had actually chosen to open this session today with an excerpt from the poem Remember by Joy Harjo of the Muskogee Nation, who is from 2019 to 2022, I believe, the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States. So part of this poem, Remember, says, "Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them, listen to them, they are alive poems. Remember the wind, remember her voice. She knows the origins of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe. And this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember that dance languages, that life is. Remember." So we hope that today, during our time together, that you will indeed remember and live and breathe into these interconnections that we all have with each other and with all elements of this earth. We also hope that you will find inspiration, motivation, and challenge to engage with us, with each other, and with the communities that you work with, live with, and are a part of yourselves in this urgent work for environmental and climate justice. We hope that as social workers, you will especially focus with us on racial justice and equity, for anti-racist practice and really radically imagining and creating a different, better world are so urgently needed. Environmental injustice and climate-related disasters are now headline news. The current flooding in California, the recent deep freeze in so many parts of the US, devastating wildfires, drought, food and water insecurity, and the tornadoes in Selma yesterday. And too often, because this world is rife with injustice and with inequity, it's communities of color, it's women, it's children, it's people with disabilities, people with inadequate access to care who suffer the most. Environmental and climate justice overlap with every single area of social work practice. And as an aside, and I actually see that there are some in the room today, if you happen to be a dean or director, or if you happen to be on a search committee, please refrain from asking us on the job market, so how is this social work? I think the laughs in the room means this has happened to some folks in the room. Because the question really is, how is this not? And more importantly than that question, what are we going to do? Environmental inequities in this country and elsewhere around the globe are long-standing and deep. In Denver, where I now live, racist redlining maps from 100 years ago map almost perfectly onto the neighborhoods today that have fewer trees, higher urban heat, higher air pollution, more vulnerability to flooding. And this is the same for so many other US cities. And of course, we know that environmental racism in this country goes back much, much further, hundreds of years, to colonization, to the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their lands, to the enslavement of Black people, for extraction, exploitation of the land itself as well. And meanwhile, it's communities who are on the front lines of climate change and environmental injustice, that really know their own needs, that have the collective wisdom to share, and that have already been organizing for their own surviving and thriving. So we need attention to this issue. We need scholarship that matters. We need collective and community organizing, and we need more radical action. Our speakers today will go deeper with these themes as we begin this critical conversation. And so let me introduce you to them by referencing another thing from yesterday, from Dr. Joe's opening to the plenary, when Dr. Joe called on us to be audacious, courageous, intentional, and loving. And I can say with every confidence that each of these speakers embodies Dr. Joe's call. People who know me know that I tear up easily, and that's how I feel right now, because I feel so lucky to get to know them, to call them my sisters, to call them my friends. Dr. Jessica Black is Gwich'in from the villages of Gwich'ajay and Tagatili, Alaska. Jessica is Faculty Research Fellow in the College of Rural, Community, and Native Education at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Her research examines governance and well-being among Alaska Native peoples, especially as it pertains to tribal stewardship and cultural connectivity. Jessica co-leads work to advance racial equity in natural resources management and focuses especially on priorities and voices of over 200 tribal sovereigns in Alaska. She resides in Fairbanks with her family, and she frequently returns home to Gwich'ajay to hunt, fish, gather, and engage in other important cultural practices. Dr. Amy Krings is Associate Professor of Social Work at Loyola University, Chicago. Her research focuses on how marginalized groups collectively advance social and environmental justice, and how social workers and community organizations can support individuals in becoming social change agents. Her current research includes environmental gentrification, intersections between abolitionism and environmental justice, and community-driven approaches that address environmental racism and other place-based harms. Amy's practice experience includes work as a community organizer, grant writer, and director of a Cincinnati-based nonprofit. And Dr. Smitha Rao is an assistant professor at the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University. Smitha's work at the intersection of environment, development, and social policy is informed by her interdisciplinary background in social work and in human geography. Her work touches upon climate change implications for vulnerable groups, energy justice, anti-oppressive practice, including abolitionism, and climate and ecological justice overall. Smitha has over a decade of macro practice experience in post-disaster community-based reconstruction and rehabilitation, campaign strategy for local and international environmental organizations on climate change, phasing out toxins from industry, and promoting sustainable agriculture. So I am going to grab a seat myself, and we will dive in with a question for everybody. We'll have conversation, and then we will also, towards the end, open it up for questions, answers, and discussions all together, as well as if we have any questions from our live stream. So our opening question. For many of us in social work, our scholarship is personal. There is a story, a turning point, or a deeper purpose that we tap into. What can each of you share with us about how you came to this work and why you pursue it still?
Are we going in order? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. That's a tough question because I feel like there's no one story, one turning point. Maybe I paid attention in school when they told us that don't burst firecrackers, they are bad, for the environment. I really took it seriously. And of course, there was the lived experience. I have actually lived in every year when the WHO puts out the list of the most polluted cities in the world. I think I can count off that list. I've lived in at least 3 or 4 every year. Growing up, I saw my father and me, come back covered in black soot from the pollution that we were actually faced with every day. It was just part of everyday life. If anybody's wondering, it's northern India, close to Delhi. You must have heard about the Delhi pollution and so on. So there's that, and then, of course, but that didn't crystallize to this work till I actually went to journalism school, wanted to write stories, did not know enough about the country or the issues, so went into social work, and then never went back to journalism. But when I was working on the rural practicum, for instance, in rural India, Maharashtra, Western India, mired by drought and rural agricultural communities, I could see the connection with the natural environment, because lives and livelihoods and living practices and cultures was so deeply integrated with that. That pretty much set me off on that path, and I think through all my practice career and now in my work, I've just followed that theme of it's not a single issue. We do not lead those single issue lives, and that's why I think I keep bringing back Audre Lorde's words here. And I think that's how I continue to find connections with people, connections with other social workers, connections with other folks who are working on these topics, bringing in perspectives and positions and learning new ideas and connecting the dots every time we are faced with, if you're talking about social protection, hey, can it also be climate resilient? Things like that. So, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. First, just want to extend thanks to Lisa and Felicia for organizing us, and to all of you for being here. A critical turning point for me, as Lisa said in the introduction, I have worked as a community organizer and a political organizer. What brought me to that work was an interest and a commitment to racial justice, especially because I was coming from Cincinnati, where, for those of you old enough to remember, back in 2001, there had been an uprising very similar to what we later saw in Ferguson. So I went to graduate school thinking that I was pursuing community organizing around policing and quelling violence in ways that didn't boost arrest. During my time in graduate school, I was at the University of Michigan. There was a Southwest Detroit neighborhood called Del Rey that was very poor, racially and ethnically integrated. And there was a proposal to build a new international border crossing that would land in Del Rey. The community was doing organizing because it had really strong concerns about what it would mean to have 10,000 additional diesel trucks going through their neighborhood each day. There were worries about an eminent domain, and not just eminent domain, but there were folks that wanted to leave if there was a new bridge there, and they wanted a fair deal if that happened. And so I was invited in to assist with that campaign, and it turned into a 4-year political ethnographic study. So in terms of what brought me to this work, it was an interest in community organizing for social and political power among marginalized groups. And the framing that they put around that was called environmental justice. It was the community, I had heard of environmental justice, but it was the community that really taught me about that movement and that philosophy and its rich roots in racial justice organizing. So that's what brought me, Lisa, and I think we'll turn back to this with future questions, but I think it's just important because I suspect there are people possibly in the room, and definitely people who are not in the room, who are doing work that really relates to environment and environmental issues, but don't quite see it as such. And I say that based from my own personal experience. So thank you again.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thank you, Lisa and Felicia, for organizing this. It's really great to be here with you all, see some familiar faces in the audience and new faces as well. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Jessica. My family is from Gwich'aghé, which is a small village in northeastern Alaska along the Yukon River. And I had the great opportunity growing up with my large extended family, including my grandparents. And I was really driven to social work by a sincere desire to help others. Growing up in Gwich'aghé with my grandparents, two values that are very central to our Gwich'in culture are care and provision for the family and sharing. And so my grandfather, who was a very quiet man, he didn't have many words, taught us a lot as we worked hard along the banks of the Yukon River at our fish camp. Embedded in his teachings were some central values in addition to sharing and care and provision for the family, and they were honoring relationships between all living beings, reciprocity to the land, showing it love and respect, as well as animals, being responsible for yourself, your family, and community, and redistributing wealth. And for us, that was fish. So that was our form of wealth. We didn't have much in terms of monetary wealth, but we did have our lifestyle. So when we'd get back to our community after a long summer fishing, 3 months, my grandfather would take his wheelbarrow and he would pull it all over town and give the best fish to older people and then people who didn't have the money to go fish. So, maybe it was single parents or those without the means to do so. And so these values that I share really shaped my desire to join in the profession of social work and really focus my time and attention on those things that were such a prominent part of my life, such as climate change, what we call climate change now, but our changing environment, which we saw every day because we lived in such close relationship. And then the stories we had to share, which were often made invisible and excluded from dominant conversations around resource management and sustainability. So I really think it was a natural fit for me. And before I sort of wrap up my response to sort of what brought me to social work and what keeps me here, is that when I was getting my doctorate especially, there was, there were people doing environmental justice work and talking about community-based research, but it was almost like, I had to always advocate for why it was social work. And when I talked about things like tribal sovereignty and tribally led research, I was almost pushed in a different direction at times, like, is this really social work, or maybe you can do that later. Luckily, I had some strong support, including Dr. Lisa and my chair, Dr. Shradden, and others who really supported my work. But it was a difficult path, and that only lit the fire within me even more, because I knew that my grandparents, who have since passed, my ancestors fought so hard to protect the land and to take care of it that, this was indeed social work, and I wanted to carry forth that legacy so that future generations could fish, that they could be in relationship with the land. And already we're seeing that that's not as possible. We haven't been able to fish for 2 years on the Yukon because of fisheries closures related to climate change, but also some other factors. So I think it just, the fire has been lit, and I love this work, and I think it's really relevant to social work.
Thank you all so much. Something I love about these conversations is how the connection points and themes start to emerge organically. There's already so much that's, even in just one question, around the depth of lived experience, the personal passion that you each have found, whether it was from your personal lives, your grandparents, your family back home, or learning from the community that you maybe weren't a part of, but you went in learning, open to learning. And then the point about these aren't single issues, they're not separate. it really is also interconnected. I have a question for each of you, kind of a tailored question for each of you, and then we'll come back to a question for everybody. So Smitha first, you come to this work with an abolitionist perspective. What does that mean for you, and what are some examples of how this has shaped your work for climate justice?
Yeah, I will preface that I'm a budding abolitionist, as everyone should be, I think. So I think the first time I read about abolitionism in relation to climate change was somewhere in 2013 or 14. There was an essay that I read about how we need to learn from the abolitionists, because that was the most radical change that has happened in this country and in the world pretty much. The abolition of slavery, that is, but we need to learn not the exact, what happened, but the radical shift that it required and the continuous work that still goes on. And that was said in the context of fossil fuel abolition. Like, we need to get rid of our habit of fossil fuel dependency. That was the first time I heard of it. I put it away, but then in the last few years, there's been this resurgence of abolitionist thought and critique, and obviously lately in social work as well, as we are seeing. There's a concurrent session right now on abolition and social work, which I wanted to be there for. But I would have loved to have more of those folks here as well to talk about how we can really bridge those connections, right? So 3 years back in SWR, a bunch of us, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Texera, Dr. Billiot, Dr. Luce, and me, we were talking about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal as an idea, it was fascinating for us as social workers. The fact that we were talking about investments, real actual investments in communities. We are looking at guaranteed pay, we are looking at guaranteed employment, healthcare for all, affordable housing, and a bunch of other things, and also focusing very specifically on frontline communities and anti-discrimination and things like that. I was like, this is it. This is what social workers can do and use as a framing to push for climate justice, right? And then it got politicized, and it was, I think the germ of that idea still lives, and I feel like there is this sort of decarceral framing to the Green New Deal itself as an idea, because it talks about reinvesting in communities that have been underinvested in historically and right now. And it's not difficult to see those connections. We are all social workers. We know how to join the dots. If you look at, for instance, communities that we talked about who are redlined and historically redlined communities, who face more pollution, more flooding risk, fewer or more delayed responses, are also over-surveilled and over-policed. So it's not difficult to make those connections if you're open to seeing that. And abolitionist thought just gives you that idea. I also noted down some other facts that I thought would be interesting to make that connection between military and climate change, right? So here's those facts. The richest countries, we know the richest countries in the world have been responsible for the historical emissions that have caused this climate crisis, right? They are spending 30 times as much on their military and armed forces as they are on climate finance. 7 of the top 10 historical emitters are also among the top 10 global military spenders. Of course, the military spending itself increases the greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the different military alliances, the NATOs of the world, they've been clear that they will not compromise military systems and dominant systems to tackle climate change. They'll make the right noises about climate change is important, we need to work on it, but they're not going to compromise. And we're seeing that right now in Russia's invasion on Ukraine, where the war was used as an excuse to increase military spending, right? And increased oil and gas investments as well. So it's not difficult to see the connections between the abolitionist thought of decarceral systems and demilitarization and the need for climate justice.
Thank you, Smitha. I love the point, all the point about what you started with about being budding, you know, because it reminds me that like we're never too late, any of us in this room, to whether you're new to the environmental and climate justice discussion or to taking it in a more critical, radical direction. Like there's always that opportunity for learning and growth and change and urgency around this work. So turning to Jessica. So Jessica, your passions include tribal sovereignty, environmental stewardship, love of the land. What does deep community partnership and leadership look like in your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question and one that I really loved thinking about. And like you said, there's so many common themes and just synergies. It's wonderful. So I always like to say deep community partnership takes a lot of time. And as an Indigenous scholar, I have to really think about my positionality a lot, because while I, am an Indigenous woman first and always, when I come into the research realm, I am seen wearing my research hat. And I come with all that brings. And it made me think of the scholarship of Dr. Linda Tahiwai Smith and her book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And she talks about how research is one of the dirtiest words that you can use in many Indigenous communities. And that's a reference to all of the harm that it's caused on Indigenous peoples and communities at the hands of research. And I have thought about it a lot, and that really frames the way that I work with community. And I was also thinking about my own grandfather, who was in the Air National Guard and was made to take a radioactive iodine pill. He spoke English as his second language, and he preferred not to. So he didn't really understand what that meant until much later. There was a big settlement, and he asked me to read the letter that came with the settlement. The tribe had called, and then he had a letter in the mail. And I was so young then, but I read the letter to him. And what they were trying to do is document and understand the impact of the iodine on the thyroid gland for people living in northern climates. But the list of that type of research and like the unethical nature of it is, the list goes on. So I do have to acknowledge those histories, and that my role when I go into communities and how research has contributed to colonization. And even if I don't do that type of research, I still carry that weight with me. So I spend a lot of time building relationship with communities, from question creation to evaluation if a community chooses to work with me. I usually start at the tribal level. In Alaska, it's very different than some of the tribes in what we call the lower 48, and very small villages and just a few people working for the tribe. So, I start there, and sometimes I am walking with my colleagues through what a project could look like and leaving the decision making up to the tribal governments. But it takes time and effort, and I sometimes, the tribe or the community will say, not at this time, we're not interested, this isn't a good time for us. And that's okay, because I trust their leadership. I trust, the process. I want to do research that has meaning and is ethical and can translate into tangible practice for not just myself, but the community moreover. I always say, I don't just do research, I have to live with my communities and my family and other tribal nations, even if I'm not a tribal member, because Alaska is a very small place. So I really work to engage in authentic relationships. At the beginning of our talk, I talked about how relationality is one of my most important values, and so I try to build very strong relationships with communities and leaders. and come as my full authentic self. So, if I'm in a community and doing research, somebody might say, well, why don't you come to this event? We're having a birthday party for our daughter. It's very important that I make that type of time to do that type of work. And it's not just work, but it's building relationship, because that is what's important to the people I work with. And so in my work, it's really it started small and it's grown very quickly, but I still ensure that building those relationships and trust is a very central theme of my work. And then also ensuring that I'm not just making a career for myself, but that what we're seeking together in relationship is something that the community needs and wants, and that I'm supporting not only their time, but their goals. And those things don't always align, and so I have to shift gears at times, and I'm okay with that. But I guess in closing, I would say something for us to all think about is it's sometimes not the type of work that's rewarded in academia, because for tenure and promotion, we're taught to seek the funding and, do the research, write the papers, and the output at a rapid pace, whereas this type of work is really different and has different goals. Can they align? Yes, but it takes time. So something for us to think about is just that. What do we reward scholars for, and how does that translate into good outcomes for the communities we work with?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I was thinking about that last point before you said it. You and I were both in that decolonizing research, social work research and education session this morning, and I think there was another one at a competing time or earlier about questioning tenure and promotion and all that, and so much of what you shared about doing this work ethically, doing this work in relationship. If your community, any community says no, then that's no, right? Like you don't go down that road, and just how important all of that is. So thank you. Amy, your work is also very closely tied to community and has included deep critiques of the neoliberal capitalist economic system in which we are still very much entrenched. Can you tell us more about how this critique relates to your work for environmental and climate justice?
So first of all, I think the environmental justice movement as a whole offers critique of our current economic and social systems. So for me, I don't necessarily feel special in that regard. If you're in relationship and in solidarity with people who are already doing this work, probably you have critiques of the neoliberal capitalist system. But in terms of those can be kind of buzzwords, and what I think that really means when you have a critical analysis can include thinking really specifically about who benefits and who is burdened by social and political systems. And it's very evident that people who are poor, racial and ethnic minorities, and the intersections therein are more likely to be heavily burdened by contamination and or lack of access to resources, which we've already touched upon. And also it's important to think not just about the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, but the decision-making processes. So who's viewed as the expert, who's included, whose priorities are given the most attention, which reminds me of some of Jessica's work. And then, of course, who's represented in terms of the important demographics matching, the people who are harmed being at the table. The other thing I would say is I don't think if you have a systemic analysis that individual interventions are sufficient. Of course they matter, every little bit matters, but it helps you also to see how important it is to have collective interventions. So I think that's part of it, how that analysis influences my work. And I guess last I would say just the importance, I think Lisa touched on this, is understanding how much of this is rooted in a devaluing both of people in place that I think is grounded in settler colonialism as well as racial supremacy.
Thank you, Amy. Which actually that leads us into our next question, actually quite well around, for everybody, for anybody now, you know, however you'd like to answer. It's impossible and unethical, really, as social workers, to address environmental and climate justice without pursuing anti-racist and equity work as well. Can you tell us more about how racism and anti-racism have affected or shaped your work?
I can kick us off, and I'll try to make my comments brief because you just heard a lot from me. But equity work has really shaped what I do. Tribal nations in Alaska are a little bit different, like I explained, in that we do have tribal jurisdiction over our tribal members, but we have limited land base, and so that's really impacted the way we're brought into conversations as tribes around climate justice, land use planning, and natural resources management. We're essentially federally recognized sovereigns with limited territorial reach. So our state and federal governments are who manage the land base, whereas some tribes, they have complete tribal jurisdiction over their land. So that really gives them a lot more recognized visibility, but also upholds that government-to-government relationship. And that has, in Alaska, what that has meant is it's led to inequity in decision-making power regarding land and natural resources management, climate justice, environmental justice, those types of conversations. And that's so odd to me because as the first peoples of the land, we have over 10,000 years of experience in living in relationship to the land. So I had mentioned salmon being a central part of my life and actually my work. And we've had a crash of salmon on the Yukon River over the last 10 to 15 years. And the reasons are climate change has really impacted salmon. They spend a majority of their life in the ocean and then they come back to their place of birth. But also a lack of Indigenous participation in decision making. And so a lot of my work is spent on bringing up those inequities and writing about it and pushing for policy change that includes Indigenous voices and seats at the table, I call them, where those decisions are made, showing up, recognizing the federal government-to-government relationship and the voices of Indigenous people. But the equity part of it is sometimes hard, I'll just say that, because you're always kind of disturbing the status quo. And there's a lot of people who don't really want that power shifted. So you become, you know, that, oh, there's Jessica again, you know, claiming there's inequities when there clearly is. But I think the work is important because as we see, as Lisa shared, you know, if you just open the news or the newspaper, there's like climate crisis after climate crisis, and we need all the best thinking at those tables. And I always voice, you know, Indigenous people are a very important part of that because we have the longest living relationship with the land and the environment, and yet a lot of times we're not brought to those decision-making tables. So I think that's really important.
I can go. I think I completely agree with the question. Obviously, that's probably racial justice, anti-oppressive practice is what underpins this climate justice work. And I also want to just point out that I see climate change, whatever crisis we are facing, as sort of the result, the culmination of sort of unbridled capitalism, also starting from Western imperialism, colonialism, and basically these isms, the structures that were really built to benefit a few and at the expense of the vast majority, which is mostly the global majority, but minoritized in some countries. So I feel like if we don't sort of deal with the underlying issue of those inequities, we're only going to be, putting maybe some overarching measures or we'll be talking about something that's not really hitting at the actual core of the issue. I just want to talk about a scholar called Jesse Rebo, who basically wrote about vulnerability does not fall from the sky. It's about understanding those underlying factors, and racism, oppressive systems in general are those. So I definitely focus on those inequities in my work. That's the bulwark of most of my work, but I also I have a fantastic team of collaborators. I'm so proud of that collaboration. I don't care if I'm the 11th author on those collaborations, but I feel like that gives me life, because I feel like we are challenging these systems with accomplices. Some of them are here. And just, I think, challenging the systems we are embedded in. I think I was in a very good session this morning who were talking about working inside, outside, and against. So that's how you subvert those systems. So I'm working inside, a little bit outside in my free time, and against in some of my writings as well. So.
I'll give 2 examples of why it's so important to have an anti-oppressive and racial justice lens when doing this work. The first is a phenomenon called environmental gentrification or green gentrification. So as we've talked about, there are places and spaces that don't have the same degree of access to clean air, clean water, parks, trees, green spaces, and that obviously is not okay. That has very serious health outcomes. We want to make sure that we prioritize that people have access to environmental amenities and those sorts of things to survive. And yet, in a market economy, there is a danger called environmental gentrification, in which you clean up the brownfields, or you clean up the river, or you plant the trees, and the market rate of that community can go up. And if that happens, what can happen is then these long-term residents can be displaced, or still in the community but begin to be over-policed or over-surveilled or feeling less comfortable, and thus reproducing the cycle of environmental injustice. So you've cleaned up the natural environment, which is a good thing, but you're ultimately reproducing the environmental injustice part, which is a bad thing, right? None of us want to inadvertently cause harm in low-income communities of color. And I think if you don't have that sort of analysis, what you can do is just look at the numbers and go, oh my gosh, how great, we cleaned it up, income went up, health improved. Obviously, that's not getting at root causes. So one of the pieces of my research has been in sociology and public health and geography. There's been a lot of work documenting when and how environmental gentrification happens. And then my work is trying to look more at interrupting those systems. So what would it mean for environmental justice to organize in a way that very explicitly and centrally integrates housing affordability and other both policy protections as well as practices to prevent that sort of thing. And then the second example that probably most of you are familiar with, I think about the Flint water crisis, which was happening while I was in grad school and living in Detroit. And we kept hearing about the water quality up in Flint, and with time came to understand that that was an entirely preventable man-made disaster of epic proportions, that people are still paying for it. And when I say paying for it, both in terms of like their life and their quality of life, but a set of decisions made on the basis of trying to save money, and now we can see that they've paid far more than they ever saved on the water system. And so the research that I was doing in partnership with community groups at that time, I think we need to be careful in the academy how we think about it, because oftentimes people point to Virginia Tech and their water research team as sort of like a hero of that story, because they came in and they were able to demonstrate that people actually really weren't lying, they really were getting sick. And so I think there were a lot of takeaways that this is like the beauty of community university partnerships, because like, you know, the community didn't have the, they weren't viewed as experts. So when they were saying they were getting sick, it wasn't taken seriously until outside researchers confirmed it. And I think we have a role there both then to participate in affirming, yes, people are getting sick, because that did stop the harm. But more than that, also doing work around power and perceptions of expertise. Because then in my time since studying Flint, more and more I'll hear of community groups saying, our kids play across the street in that empty field and they get rashes, and we keep telling people and they don't take it seriously. And later the Harvard medical team came in and demonstrated that they actually are getting sick. So I think there's a gap, and I think social workers can help as bridge builders in a way that lifts up people whose voices need to be lifted up, and in a way that isn't supplanting existing leadership and existing organizing work.
Thank you. So if you've moderated conversations like this, you know that you have a plan, and that they know your plan, but then your brain starts percolating, and then you throw a curveball because you have a question that's come to mind you want to ask, right? So Amy, you had started to get to this, actually what my question, impromptu question was going to be, which was I was going to ask, and so if any of you might, you know, go a little deeper. Do you have any other examples to share of what has been effective in your work so far in actually accomplishing some of this change, trying to change this decision-making and power, trying to challenge and actually accomplish some change, even if it's incremental at times, the power structures that exist in this work?
I can say, I actually think this is kind of a good thing. I don't have a magical story to lift up and say, oh, look, I did this and then this happened. But I don't think for me, that's not my theory of change, right? So going back to like my dissertation in Southwest Detroit, they did ultimately win a community benefits agreement. Now, having said that, it took nearly 10 years, which matters because during that whole time, people are getting sick and some are moving away, but ultimately they got a win. Now, did my research make that happen? No. But did I have a role in providing some support along the way? I would like to think so. So it would be laughable for me to claim that credit. But they got a win, and I feel like I pitched in my little way. So for me, I tend to think of social change happening collectively. And so I don't really have the goal that at the end of my paper, I'll get a win. I mean, I'd be open to that happening. I just don't think it does. Not in my experience.
So I have an example that is fun and rewarding, but like Smitha said, you know, I have a lot of collaborators that can't be on this stage, and most of them live in community, and just want to recognize, you know, all my colleagues and friends that I built relationships with, which with this work wouldn't be possible. But one thing that has been really inspiring is one of the projects I work on, I was able to hire a lot of students, both undergraduate and graduate students. And they are actually carrying out a lot of the research in their home communities. So for many of my students who are Alaska Native, they get really homesick. You know, they come to school in the city, and it just was sort of a win-win because they can go home to their communities, do the research, and they really inform the way in which we do the work. So I consider that like they're carrying out this really meaningful work, some in their own Indigenous language with their elders, and so just really proud of them and the work. The other thing that happened is from that project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation, another project grew out of that, which were the more policy-directed needs that we need more Indigenous representation. So we have a project called Damamta, and it means all of us in the Sugpiaq language, and it's a graduate research traineeship. And so we have 2 cohorts so far of graduate and PhD students getting their degrees in fisheries or related sciences so that they can help effectuate change in the systems of the federal and state government. And 80% of the graduates in the School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences go on to be in management positions. So I'm really proud of that project because it is effectuating change through an Indigenous lens. And there is a deep sense of well-being because the students are able to work in their communities, which, you know, we're told by our elders, go get your education, come back and work for your people, but that's not always possible if the jobs aren't there. And this is a case where there are the jobs, and they're able to bring in their whole self and change policy and advocate for social justice and some of the values that us as social works really aspire to. So I'm really proud of that project as well. But it is very collaborative in nature, and just wanted to recognize all my partners.
Very short answer. I don't have a win to talk or brag about since I joined academia. But in practice, you see the small wins a lot. You know, even if it is convincing, you know, a decision maker to have a meeting with communities that are not often heard, that I consider it a win sometimes. You know, organizing communities in drought-affected areas to go and, you know, put their demands ahead in front or ask for something and get that. That's a huge win. As a disaster response professional, I was, again, joining the dots. I was basically just doing what the community asked me to do, right? I was not the expert, but I could maybe be the liaison with some of those decision makers who don't have access to these communities and who these communities don't have an ear of. So I feel all of those small practice wins kind of count for this question.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of adapt again because I feel like it's a better segue to one of our other questions we talked about maybe asking today, which I'm going to insert now. So that question is that many academics play it safe. We continue to work within systems, pursuing incremental change rather than disrupting or creating something radically new. Some of us, anyway. In your own work for environmental and climate justice, is there a risk that you've taken, a more radical direction you've pursued, or one that you might plan to pursue next that comes to mind?
Are we talking individually or at a bigger scale or both?
However you wish, Smitha. Yeah.
I'll just give an example and then you can take off. I think not being afraid of saying divest from fossil fuels, even in big university meetings where decision makers are in the audience. That's something I have done. I don't know if there'll be repercussions for that, but I think we all need to do that. So that's one example.
I mean, I just think it's such a good question. It speaks to our broader political climate because I mean, part of what happens, I think, with conversations about environmental issues is they're painted as radical when they're really quite rational, right? And so when you see water protectors who are doing so for their survival of themselves and their families and their communities because you need water to live, and then they're painted as these like radical people, I mean, it's really insulting. You know, is it that radical to be like, we need clean air to live, and we would like our children and our children's children to be able to live, and likewise water. I mean, these are not luxuries, right? It's about survival, basic survival, and that is not radical. And so how wild that we're in an environment where some of those sorts of positions can be framed as radical when it's like just so basic. And so I think I'm in Chicago. It's like a pretty progressive town. I don't feel like it is so risky for me to make claims about changing our political economic system in a way that is more sustainable, or integrating abolition with environmental work. I was laughing, like I went to this coffee shop around the corner from my house, and I could hear the people next to me were talking about abolition, and the people over there were talking about abolition. It's like not that radical, okay? But I have colleagues here outside of Chicago that would be. I guess the risk is, okay, might I like to leave Chicago someday? You know, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. So I guess the last thing I want to say is even with integrating abolition, which for some people is a very scary word, if you've been doing the work and you have witnessed or read statistics about, for instance, the EPA just having disproportionate response rates that vary on the basis of race, or that fines can vary on the basis of race. I'm not saying necessarily it's intentional, it could be unintentional, but there are real and meaningful differences. It's reasonable to start to ask yourself, especially if you're in a racial minority community, like, is the EPA actually the thing here? Or might it actually make more sense to come up with more mutual aid mechanisms of care? I mean, so these ideas that are perceived as radical become, I mean, they're strategic too. So anyway, thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, my mind is like spinning thinking about what you all said. And actually, if you were to come work where I work, you wouldn't hear these conversations. In fact, you know, I live in Alaska. It's a very red state. We're a big oil state. The state funds the university, and then there's also federal funding. So early in my career, I felt like these conversations, I remember having a conversation with my main research partner, and I was like, Courtney, I may not get tenured, I may not have a job, because I was still a junior scholar, and I said, I just want you to know that, because we were really pushing on racial equity in fisheries, and the governor appoints the board of fish, and the governor allocates funding to the university, and we're like, what we were considered radicals pushing for transformation in fisheries. And I remember that conversation with her, and we wrote DMUMTA, and everybody's like, oh, you're never gonna get that. Nobody gets funded in the first time. It's too radical what you're saying. And I remember we held our breath because we had asked for a letter of support from the university, and it was just like, not to be rude, because I have a very good relationship with the administrators, but it was very like, lukewarm, like this project has the opportunity to make change, very like basic, and I felt very like hurt by that, because I was like, we really need a strong letter of support. we ended up getting funded, and we sort of breathed a sigh of relief because we were like, okay, we can start really doing this work. But I always wondered if I would get tenure because of the political ramifications of what I was saying. I did end up getting tenure, but I think it kind of, I mean, I was relieved, but at the same time, you know, it's not just about us, it's about the communities we work with, their voices being elevated. And I think, you know, how as social workers can we make that happen? You know, how can we bring the people we work with and have them considered to be the experts? That's something I'm still working towards, and there's a lot of challenges to doing that because the status quo is very embedded, and academia is very much a part of like perpetuating, you know, certain levels of colonization and even the content that we teach and when, you know, who started different movements. And so, you know, challenging those things can come at a cost because some of the pushback isn't always transparent. It's more nuanced and subtle, and that can take a toll, of course, on scholars. So, you know, I think that I've taken some risks, but I've also been very afraid at times for my own career. And I told my partner, well, if I don't have a job, I'll do this or that. And he was like, is there a risk? Or, you know, but I think it comes at a cost at times. It's not always like this valiant thing that you're doing. And so I just think that we can all think about how to make spaces for these conversations is to make space for these conversations. So I just really want to thank you both for doing that, because often these conversations are not held, and that says a lot to us that study in this area. So thank you.
Thank you all. Let me ask one more question for the group up here, and then we'd love to open it up for questions and discussion, and please use the microphones around the room for that. But one more question. So some in this audience and perhaps on live stream are familiar to the four of us up here. There are other social work scholars who also focus on or identify their own work as connected to environmental and climate justice. And many others are not familiar to us or are here for the first time learning more about these issues. They may be focusing on health policy or aging, child welfare, housing, so many other areas in which they may be experts. What do you think are some specific opportunities that we have to integrate environmental and climate justice across areas of social work?
I mean, I think there's two approaches that well, there's probably a whole bunch of approaches, but I'm going to name two, and probably what's right is to do a blend. One approach would be to say that we would have everyone who's here at this conference think and reflect deeply about how the built and the natural environment impacts them and the people with whom they work. And maybe at first they might have a hard time thinking about it, but I bet if they thought long and hard enough, they might start thinking about things like anything from food security to access to transportation, to they have asthma and a lot of people in their community also have asthma. Or maybe on the flip side, they might notice, well, the people with whom I work tend to feel better when they're in a park or in a forest or at the ocean or what have you, okay? So one would be by acknowledging the literal environment, the built and the natural environment within their existing practice, and maybe thinking about what it means then to integrate that within their existing work in ways that might be more incremental. Another approach could be something that's more like theoretical, philosophical, where you start to think about the world and your place within it and being in right relationship with the environment differently. And so then you start to see your work as, whether it's incremental or more radical, always going toward a North Star. And that North Star would be something like a sustainable economy, or not causing harm to the degree that you can in terms of where you shop, or making sure that you're having as many sustainable practices and buying into and being part of sustainable communities. Probably there's a mix of those, right? There's probably people that might be able to take a few steps without having like a philosophical change. And also, I think we need to work towards, as a profession, what it might look to have a more philosophical change. So maybe those are just two ideas to kind of get us cooking.
I also have a couple ideas, I think. One is, this is an example that we are actually currently going to experiment with at my school. So we talk about how systems of oppression are interconnected, right? So we thought of, how do we get more people to be thinking about the environment, thinking about the climate, thinking about food? So we are launching a very short 21-day anti-oppression challenge, which last time was on anti-racism, but this time it's really on hyper-consumerism. And that really, because that's one identity that ties all of us, right? Whether or not we believe in climate change or not, we are all American consumers, right here. And this is all about hyperconsumption, especially here in this country. So linking that specific identity to the different aspects of food, fashion, the clothes we wear, the gadgets we carry, we're all complicit, right? That's the beginning point. None of us is kind of away from it all. We are all complicit in this system because it is, after all, capitalism, the racial capitalism especially. So looking at that, and then environmental and climate justice as well, and then teasing out the intersectionalities within each of those topics as well. So that's a way to really look at it as an individual and see how it connects, your action connects to the bigger systemic issues. I'm excited about how the response to that will be. The second is really about, what we do as social workers, building bridges. So my focus definitely has been to do my own work, because this is all I have done all my life. As an activist, as a campaigner, as a community organizer, but now as an academic, I'm doing my own personal, this is my passion project. But I also try to work with people who are not really connected to what I'm doing, but trying to tease out those commonalities. So over the last year, we've spoken to all the emergency response professional in Columbus, Ohio, and also rural Ohio. Talked to the city offices, talked to the area agencies on aging, just brought together a bunch of people who are really, everybody's concerned about improving livability of people of all ages, right? And I'm working with gerontologists, so they are concerned about older adults. And there's a vast literature on how there are differential impacts on older adults. And then there are the housing experts. So what I'm trying to say is that it takes a lot of work, a lot of meetings, a lot of dead ends, but getting people together and talking about what are those commonalities. Okay, older adults, we had some extreme weather, extreme heat events this year. We even had an extreme, like the bomb cyclone that happened. What happened to the older adults? Did they have to be evacuated? What about the affordable housing places specifically for older adults? So you can quickly see those different connections come together, that, okay, older adults residing in affordable housing, especially the minoritized older adults. There's the gender component. How does it all come together, and what are the systems currently doing, and how can we bring them together in conversation? And that's something that, so many social workers are working on: mental health, on housing, on children's health, on older adult welfare. Those are clear connections that we can make with environmental and climate work.
Yeah, so thank you both. Really lots to think about. When I was thinking about this question, I was actually kind of thinking, I think very holistically. That's just sort of the way that I was raised. But I was thinking about all of us and taking this 30,000 foot view, and I actually visualized myself on a plane because I had to fly here from Alaska, and it was a very bumpy ride the whole way down. So I was like thinking about this plane, but I'm more like, how does climate and environmental justice not impact every one of us? Because I think about our elders, and I was thinking about Katrina. A lot of them were trapped in their nursing homes. I was thinking about child welfare and how our children are so vulnerable to these climate injustice, along with like food insecurity, things like that. And health policy, all of this impacts people's physical, spiritual, and mental health when your environment is disrupted. Or what we're seeing in California is the most vulnerable aren't able to go out and buy, they have to submit their paperwork to get reimbursed if their homes are destroyed, and just not having the capital, economic capital to buy a new home, right? Or go buy a bunch of food during a pandemic and store it. So I think it's very interrelated, but we have to step back, kind of like what you were saying, is really think about the interconnections of environmental and climate change to the populations we work with. And there's a real opportunity now, because with this administration, it seems like there's been a lot of attention focused on it, partly because what's going on in our world right now. Every day you open the paper and it's like somewhere is experiencing drought or intense flooding or wildfire. And so those folks that we all work in relationship with are often the ones that are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change and environmental justice and like the health disparities. So we have to help connect those dots in the work we do, the funding proposals we write, to make it known that these things are very interrelated and we can't disjoint one area from another, or we're doing a great disservice. So we have to really think holistically and from that larger scope and think about how these things are related. And I think there's a real opportunity in that.
Thank you all so much. I truly feel so grateful to be in community with you on this stage, but also just you're each a part of my life, honestly, in this work and also personally. And I want to go back again just to those opening words from Dr. Joe yesterday, that you really do each embody, for me, being audacious, courageous, intentional, and loving, and I'm just so grateful for that. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, discussion. We invite you to please come to the microphones on either side as we open it up for, I was peeking at Smitha's watch this whole time to keep me on track. So I think we have 15 minutes if your watch is correct. So that worked out well. We didn't plan that one. Someone always goes. Someone will go. It's like class.
I feel uncomfortable in silence.
Perfect.
I'm Brenda Smith from the University of Alabama, and just thank you all so much. What a wonderful panel, really great. I want to ask a question bouncing off Lisa's question about taking risks and courage, and I really appreciated the responses to that. There was so much vulnerability and openness in the responses. And I know we're at a research conference, but the question relates to something I've been thinking about as a social work educator, and how we do a pretty good job teaching our students to do policy advocacy and maybe even community organizing to some extent. But it seems to me that something missing from our social work education is helping our students to have the skills to challenge people in authority, to take risks, to have courage. I feel that these could be skills or tools that our students could have who also could be very vulnerable, as some of you described, in their working within social work organizations. And I wondered if any of you have thoughts about that, or things you've taught your students, or examples that you could share with us about social work education.
I love that question. I'll try. Well, I would like to say that my kind of, like, I have an ulterior motive of radicalizing my students a lot of times. I don't look like, I am that radical, but really I have hung off bridges, and that was me painting on the Save Climate coal carrier. So there is that streak in me. I feel like maybe with age I'm trying to pass the baton on to others, but I feel that's definitely super important, like telling folks and showing possibilities of what can be done, the challenging of authority. And that's something that I agree that we don't teach in schools of social work here in the United States. I did my social work training in India, and I feel like the school was where we challenged authority. We were encouraged. I think every batch of students protested on something, and it was encouraged, because that's really the learning ground, right? And students from there would go out and put their bodies on the line and make actual sort of just take actual risks and challenge people, even at their own convocation ceremonies or later. It was just something that was part of the culture of where I went to school. And I would love to see that here, absolutely. Maybe 1 or 2 professors do that here at every place, but I would love to see a little bit more. And yeah, I completely agree. And also just on that topic of, because we're talking about climate change and because we're talking about subverting the system and the abolitionist sort of perspective as well, I think we have, in this country again, we don't talk about direct action at all. And I feel there's a lot of work on how we actually need to go out and stop some of these violent sort of the fossil fuel companies and so on, which are often, a lot of environmental activists are currently in jail across the world. And also, I think the number of activists killed is rising. And over the last decade, I lost count of how many, it's in the thousands, right? Women especially, water protectors, indigenous land protectors. But the idea is that the carceral system, again, doubles down on those individuals and tells them that you cannot destroy the property. But then if we look at the bigger picture about how much property is destroyed because of the runaway climate crisis, maybe we can kind of see where the balance hangs, something.
Just very briefly, I want to shout out the work of Finn Bell and Mary Kate Dennis. For this question, I'll just say it again for those writing it down, Finn Bell and Mary Kate Dennis. And specifically, they have a paper, I know it has water protectors in the title, I don't remember the exact title. But I think that for folks interested in looking at models for what does it mean to be in solidarity with people doing this sort of work, and what does it mean to think about different types of privilege. So there are some people that probably can challenge authority in a very explicit, bold way, and for others that would be a very dangerous decision. And so they talk about some of those things, and then also what that means for social work and social work education. So that was sort of the reference and example that came to my mind with that question.
Yeah, I think my example is maybe a little, well, I don't want to label it, but I work across many departments And a lot of my students, they have to interface with a lot of different educators who may not have that emphasis on advocacy and racial equity. So I spend lately a lot of my time, I was trained in what's called Alaska Native Dialogues on Racial Equity to host critical conversations. So I invite faculty who either are curious about some of the work that I'm doing or against it to come to these critical dialogues, and we spend 2 days together around racial equity, and we really get to the heart of the issue of like racial equity in education or fisheries. And we have a whole way of laying out the conversation. And it's kind of painful at times because you have to have the conversation on racism, or you have to have the conversation on colonization. And it gets uncomfortable. But we start with some agreements that we all agree to, which prevent it from going spiraling out of control. And I would have to say it's gone very well. Now, does everybody leave the conversation in agreement? Of course not. People are on their own path in this work, and some not at all. But I feel like as a faculty member in this work, it's really my job to push it forward in a meaningful way, and I rely on my allies to help carry this work within their own communities, whether that's, fisheries or education or social work. And we engage in those conversations, and then we continue them. We follow up, we provide readings to those who have joined us. And so that has gone really well in helping to advance this work. And I always say, you can't unknow what you came to know. So even if people don't agree with me, they've heard it and they think about it. And to me, that's a win, especially for my students who have to face some of these professors who are really, abrupt and sometimes are perpetuating these things that we don't want to be perpetuated.
I'll add a quick answer, and then I think we can squeeze in this question that's come in from the live stream as well. So I stepped into the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs role 6 months ago at DU. And so 2 things that sound obvious, I think, but I've been surprised that maybe aren't as obvious or as across the board. I think with the student activism, because we have plenty of that at GSSW, and of course I have a different lens on it now, or role and responsibility on it now with my position, but how schools engage with when students are challenging authority, challenging decisions, advocating for things within the schools of social work that they are a part of, how we respond to that is really important for then the students continuing on with that outside of our schools. So I think that's really important. And then this seems so mundane, but I'm surprised now that I have a broader cross-cutting look at our syllabi, more syllabi than I used to have eyes on. I'm surprised by how many still have kind of traditional assignments, term papers, things that aren't so relevant, that aren't, or sometimes assignments that are extractive from community. And I think there's even just still that, questioning, rethinking that as part of our pedagogy that can speak to this preparing students for direct action, challenging authority. And just to clarify a different point here, the picture Smitha was referencing, it's the picture on the right. It's a coal carrier in the ocean, and Smitha is in the boat conducting the painting, the direct action on this coal carrier. Let me pose this question. It sounds like it's from possibly a social work faculty member, I think. The question is, I've become really interested in the intersection between environmental justice and economic justice, and will be including some content in a course this semester. Can you please comment some more? Environmental justice and economic justice. We have just a few minutes left, and then we'll wrap up after that question.
Last year, I was part of a visiting professor opportunity in Finland, with a group of scholars there from around the world, not just Nordic countries, but they were taking seriously this question of what different economies might look like, and how to have an eco-social business practice and taking that up to scale to economy. They had a really special doctoral program with 15 students from around the world that could apply just to be in this cohort looking at those sorts of issues. And those 15 are kind of going through the ranks right now. And so I think we're about to have a very special cohort of people coming out of that program asking exactly those issues. So first I would say to probably check out the work of Kati Nari and Aila-Leena Matthews in Finland, and through some Googling, I bet you could find the Astra program. I think beyond that, I would just say that sounds great. I don't think you can separate the two. I don't think in the US context, at least from what I've seen, I think we could do better. I think there's a lot of room to take on those issues. So for any doc students out there, I think that would be very well received. Thumbs up.
I would just quickly say, keeping the whole radical theme alive, looking at degrowth as an alternative to the capitalist economic model that we kind of take for granted, and see the interconnections with what we do as social workers. There's care work, the reimaginings, basically, of the systems, the economic systems that we have.
Yeah, I would just say that one exercise that's pretty fun I've done with my students is having them explore what is an economy, what does that look like in your community, and it's so interesting. It's very context specific to Alaska, but a lot of my students shared how, what is valued is very different than the capitalistic system, and there's this rub because, they're encouraged to go get a job, like a full-time job, make a living, share some of that wealth, but what they want to do is live in a cultural way, and that doesn't always align, right? And so the economy, what is an economy question, is very interesting, the kind of responses you get, because for them, sustaining their community, their ways of life is what's important, but that doesn't always align with making, a salary and working a full-time job, and it comes at a cost. So I think if we can rethink globally or like within our own spaces, what is an economy look like? What does that mean for people? We can really get at that environmental justice and sustainability, because people have the ideas wherever you go. I think it's on people's mind, whether or not they study it, that we're living in very intense changing times, and we really need to think critically about the environment and sustainability. But in order to get at the economic piece, is what is an economy? Is it just money? Well, no. It looks different in different contexts. And so exploring that with your students would be really interesting, because it forces them to critically think about that through their own lens and the work that they do. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to each of you who joined us today in person or on the live stream. Thank you to Josh for helping us with our tech support here and making sure all ran smoothly. And please join me in thanking each of our speakers today. Thank you all.